Assalamualaikum and hi. My name is Sharil Hamdan. You might know me from Keluar Sekejap and other offshoots of that brand. Thank you for all the support. I'm trying something different here. I'm calling this series Subtext, where on occasion, I will share more considered thoughts about topics that I care about. Not in a sit on the couch and chat kind of way, but in a I've spent real time thinking about this and writing this down kind of way. Things that become perspectives, which I hope can provoke your own set of thoughts on topics that matter, especially but not necessarily always about Malaysia. This is obviously a raw and an inaugural attempt, and I apologize in advance if the audio quality isn't great or if the way I present perspectives in this format isn't quite perfect yet. But please share your comments on the platforms that you're listening to this on, or email me at the address provided in the description. So let's dive into the pilot episode of Subtext with Sharil Hamdan. And today we're talking about what the Fashion Valet controversy tells us about trust and privilege. I think we can all agree that the Fashion Valet saga that broke in early November has instigated something much larger than a conversation about one failed investment into a fashion e-commerce platform. What began as a seemingly routine disclosure, a sharp loss incurred by two Malaysian institutions, Khazanah National and PNB, who together invested and then lost almost all of 47 million ringgit, has since unraveled into a national debate about and scrutiny of Malaysia's venture ecosystem and the government-linked investment companies or GLICs that deploy public funds loosely defined into the space. At the time of recording, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, MACC, apparently just wrapped up their investigations to ascertain if what occurred in Fashion Valet was just a failed investment with mistakes in management, mistakes in monitoring, or if something more sinister went on. At the behest of the Prime Minister, Khazanah has also been instructed to launch an internal audit of their investment. Not to be outdone, Parliament's Public Accounts Committee announced it will launch its own investigation. Now, all of this ostensibly because the public outcry has been loud, the demand for corrective action, perhaps of retribution, unrelenting. But whatever comes of these investigations, or any legal process that may or may not follow, is almost not the point here. Because this episode has already left its mark on the investing ecosystem, including on the institutional capital allocators upon which the former still relies. We've heard, comfortingly in my view, the Minister of Finance Tu Amir Hamzah stressed that this case will not cause institutions like Khazanah to shy away from investing in venture. But that's not to say nothing will change. Indeed, I contend that much already has. I've thought a bit about this, not just as someone who is making his way in the venture ecosystem, but also as someone with previous experience in the Malaysian public life and politics that made me wonder quite early on in this saga about whether what's unfolding here is even about venture investments at all. That made me question if we might just be glimpsing one manifestation of a larger slide in social relations. You're listening to the pilot episode of Subtext with Sharil Hamdan, where I'm talking about what the Fashion Valet controversy might be telling us about where we are as a society. In one sense, there's something about the Fashion Valet controversy that feels inevitable, especially after it happened. Vivi Yusuf's designer handbags, the hyper-advertised lifestyle, the ill-advised remarks, I don't need to list them here, you can find them if you wanted to. All these meant that the company and its founder were always going to attract heightened scrutiny and anger once they took quasi-public funds and ultimately lost it. You don't have to condone some of the hate directed towards her, and I certainly have seen some comments that go beyond what ought to be acceptable, to be unsurprised that it happened. In fact, you could mount a defense of her actions and refashion them in their, quote, proper context. You might even suggest that there is a not insignificant tinge of sexism that explains the level of vitriol, and still understand why for many people those same actions and remarks elicited a latent ill feeling which then exploded into a collective character judgment when things went south. Yet, I don't think we should interpret this as an isolated outlier case. Yeah, there are things that make this case uniquely positioned to provoke the feelings that it did. But look more closely, and I think this episode is better interpreted as a totem of our changing relationship with status, wealth, aspirations, and above all, our relationship with privilege. Today, that totem is Fashion Valet and Vivi Yusuf. Tomorrow, it could be someone or something else altogether. But that there is a shift seems worthy of some examination. It feels to me that at the core of this changing relationship is about trust and the gradual breakdown of trust. But trust of what? Trust of who? Of the founders from well-off families who seek funds from national institutions? Of the usually faceless bureaucrats who sign off on these checks? Of the flashy venture capitalists who invest in these companies using other people's money? Of the well-heeled corporate enablers who tell the noisy public to get a life? Of the government representatives who insist that a few losses in startups are small in relation to the portfolio? I think for some, it is all of the above caricatures, and more importantly, what they represent. That the way I've described these caricatures are crude and one-sided is not the point. That's what caricatures are. It is that they exist at all in people's imaginations. And if I'm right, the negative feelings that they engender stem from one feature they all share, the feature of being well-connected, of having the privilege of membership in an exclusive club that not everyone can access and within which they flourish in a cycle of mutual enforcement and advancement. Cue the rich helping the rich. And that goes to the heart of understanding why Fashion Valet elicited the response that it did, and of the changing relationship I spoke of, about trust and privilege, or more to the point, about trust of privilege. My own thinking on this has evolved over the last weeks. Initially, I thought, as many doubtless did, that the proper response was to educate the public. As if to say, if only the public knew that 45 million was tiny compared to the many billions managed by the cliques. If only the public knew that for every handful of failed investments, there is one that generates outsized returns. If only the public knew that investing in loss-making companies was very normal and very necessary. If only the public knew that to pay yourself dividends before selling your company is absolutely the done thing because buyers don't want to pay multiples on your cash. If only the public knew, the list goes on. But then I realized that that would be a terribly incomplete diagnosis of the moment. Because if in response to public outcry, our first instinct is to educate through some clinical explanation about finance, and not to understand, not to be curious about where the skepticism comes from, it would be exactly the kind of thing that got us here in the first place. Don't get me wrong, there is a place for helping the public understand the features and roles of particular investments or asset classes or institutions, and that should be made to occur over time. But the lack of familiarity about these things is not the root of the problem, it is a symptom. A symptom of the perceived and real inaccessibility to these jobs, to these heights, to these paths of wealth. And an inaccessibility felt worse if the people viewed to be at the top of the pile engage in not so subtle condescension, a symptom of privilege. So, our institutions, the other arms of our establishment, and frankly, likely listeners to this essay, we all need to understand that the questions being asked out there aren't just about financial returns. They're about something more fundamental. Who really benefits from these investments, even when they go well, and especially when they go bad? Are decisions about who gets support truly meritocratic? Could the monies have been spent on something that would have made a faster, more material difference to everyday lives in the toughest communities? These are not easily answered through quantifiable jargon. These are subjective inquiries that are as much about how people feel as they are about what people know. And simply forcing them to know more won't help change how they feel. Has this tension always been this sharp, this present? Or is this moment a turning point where simmering frustration with the privileged and the connected elite occasionally boils over? It's hard to say. Throughout this essay, you will hear me say the word gradual a few times. Gradual shift in relations, gradual breakdown in trust. There's a reason I don't use the word rupture. As Malaysians, I don't think we typically do ruptures. We prefer the slow burn, the slide. I've always felt in Malaysia we have a peculiar relationship with status and titles. Say what you want, but a lot of people still yearn for that datukship. And there are various social settings in which these titles still matter some. It seems we are both repelled and attracted to wealth, to status, and the performance of it. I recently had a conversation with a friend who lamented how in Malaysia, people still care too much about who your father is, and not judge you for who you are. And how wedding invitations are filled with bin datos and binti tantris, and people who feel the need to wear those titles on their sleeves. I think without overstating things or venturing even more than I already have into pop psychology or pop sociology, these are banal observations that point to the vestiges of an old feudal order that remains in our cultural DNA while also now being subjected to polite ridicule. In this gradual, that's the word again, shifting moment, more people are questioning and critiquing these symbols and representations of an order they find problematic for the times, yet are not ready to fully let go. Now, sometimes these symbols and representations are fleeting, frivolous, hard to grasp. While other times, they come packaged as a person that becomes a locus of indignation. So if I'm right, then perhaps the better question isn't whether this divide is new, but why we're seeing it so clearly now. Unsurprisingly, social media plays a huge role, collapsing the distance between the elite and the everyday, while at the same time starkly reinforcing and vivifying, pun intended, the inequality that makes the elite interesting in the first place. These elites are now not remote figures moving in untouchable circles. They're on people's screens, on their feeds. What this new terrain gives, it also takes. This public celebrity culture provides an intimacy that strips away the mystique of privilege, leaving behind raw questions. How did she get here? What does he represent? And at some point, what do they owe us? Seen in this sense, Fashion Valet is a tale of precisely this feature. Because for a while, it was about openly selling a lifestyle, a personal brand, an aspiration that was interesting precisely because it was ostentatious, to great commercial effect. Until it wasn't. You're listening to the pilot episode of Subtext with Sharil Hamdan, where I'm experimenting with a new format of audio engagement on topics that I care and think about. Please share your comments and feedback at the end of the episode. Up to this point, in this episode, I've suggested that the Fashion Valet controversy, which is what we're talking about here, is a totem of society's changing relationship and trust level with and of privilege. I'd like to continue with that suggestion here, but do it from a slightly different angle. Perhaps this is a good time to look at the other side of this broader story, the people classed as privileged. For the individual on the wrong end of the stick, as it were, he or she might also feel aggrieved. If you were in certain circles, you would have seen and sensed this in some of the responses and the bewilderment when this whole story broke. In a way, the reaction to the reaction told its own story. Very few people would readily accept that their successes are down to the lottery of circumstance, or worse, a reflection of the pejorative know-who rather than the meritocratic know-how. Whether they are startup founders or CEOs or big-time politicians, it's human to want to own who you are and not apologize for it. Or at the very least, most would want recognition of the scars that they bear. Absent that, there can be a sense of being unfairly assessed by a public desiring of displays of contrition more than confidence. I've struggled with this myself. In the public imagination, there will always be skepticism about who I am, what I am, and how I got here. By any objective measure, I am a well-off member of society. That alone, many will hasten to add, is not the issue. But what is the issue for some is that because of my very public association with a political and a government past, this is sufficient grounds to make me fair game in the occasional insinuations of being undeserving or unclean. For those who hold such views, I therefore shouldn't try to be too smart or too cute. I'll be careful here because sometimes irony and self-deprecation doesn't travel well through audiovisual. It is true that I bear the markers of privilege and good fortune. It is also true that I grew up the first 9 years of my life in a 2-bedroom low-cost flat, and that much of my upbringing was decidedly unremarkable. In my own more regrettably self-pitiful moments under the public gaze, I must admit I sometimes wish that more people would entertain the possibility that there was nothing inevitable about where I had ended up, that I had earned it, that I was less boy with silver spoon and more man who made good. While also wondering if what I got was that great after all. The spectre of an unholy resentment and ingratitude always lurking in the shadows. This feeling of being both defiant and insecure in the face of mass public judgment is part of the whole mix and makes this all the more human. I bring this up not to dive into my own ongoing journey to self-assuredness, there can be another time for that, but because while I might be a tad more thoughtful about these things than the usual person in similar circumstances, I'm certain other people who have also been on the receiving end of brutally binary judgments do feel a certain kind of injustice. And because I think considering the perspective of privilege, which oscillates between the extremes of outright rejection and wholesale embrace of his own existence, is an important feature of the overall story here, and a reminder that this changing and ambivalent relationship with privilege is not just a matter for those who don't have it, but also those who do. The problem is though, and I don't have a good answer for this, is when there is clearly decades of nepotism, cronism, exclusivism. Then there is little patience for nuance in judging individual cases for what they are. Does it matter if you were fully privileged or only came into it later in life? Does it matter if you only benefited from your, quote, cable once to land that cushy job and that you didn't actually do anything dodgy? Does it matter that you claim to have had good intentions when you joined that organization or that political party? In the eyes of an indignant mass, you are still a beneficiary and a prop of an unjust system. Let's be clear, people everywhere benefit from networks. They benefit from a leg up. Some play the game better than others, and in doing so, they might skirt the line of what is right and what is proper. In other places, people might even praise you for it and call it creativity. But in this shifting moment in Malaysia, where trust is on trial and there's an awakening of sorts, where many people feel the game is rigged, can you really blame them if now and then, alongside fascination and admiration of the elites, some also resent or smell you as guilty by association? I don't know. Maybe you can. Maybe you can appeal to their better self. Or maybe grudgingly you accept that this is the price, this is the grand bargain of being a beneficiary of a system that has locked out too many people for too long. And in doing so, you fight against feeding your own version of resentment that only makes the steady slide worse. As you can tell, I don't have any easy answers about how to bridge this distrust, how we break these parallel resentments, at least not on a systemic level. I don't think any easy answers exist beyond platitudes about the need to build a more just, a more equitable society, which is of course the only permanent fix here. But fully unpacking what that would take and the many paths it can take is a task for another time, for others, and a task so ridden with complexity that even if it were committed to paper, risks eventually being lost in the mountain of academic policy-making proposals that this country has seen. But I will say one thing that is surely part of the equation of making things ever so slightly better. We need institutions who are up to the task of recognizing the moment and responding appropriately. What has been striking in this Fashion Valet controversy is how muted the responses have been from those at the center of it, and how aggressive the responses have been from those investigating it. I'll be careful here, but I don't think either has been right. While the authorities have made TikTok videos of raids and issued daily updates that feed the beast, the Glicks and the VCs have either issued solitary reactive statements or remain conspicuously silent. This lack of engagement isn't just a PR shortcoming to me. It speaks to a deeper issue about Malaysia's institutional and corporate elites not yet fully grasping that the landscape is changing in profound ways. Remember I said this moment tells us a lot about what people feel. There's a performative quality to much of Malaysia's institutional and corporate life that seems woefully inadequate here. From perfectly staged press conference to cautiously worded statements, the focus often seems to be on the optics of saying something rather than actually making a dent in the way people feel. In fact, some take it to the logical conclusion that maybe the best response is no response at all, to stay outside the line of fire, as it were. The Fashion Valet case feels like an extension of this overall pattern. The expectation is that a few well-timed gestures, if that, will be enough to satisfy, or better yet, escape public scrutiny. I understand the appeal of that approach. In the old world, it probably would have worked. But we are shifting to a different world, one from which I don't think we are ever coming back. This prospective new world is where viral activism can spread corporate panic and losses. Just look at KK Mart, Starbucks, Chargy for evidence. More importantly, in this shifting moment, to shun attention entirely would be, for me, the wrong lesson to learn, the wrong approach to take. Instead, it should be about leaning into the terrain. Our institutions can't build trust behind a wall of faceless bureaucracy. For our GLCs and our GLICs and soon our broader corporate establishment, part of recognizing the moment here is realizing that keeping your head down, hoping the spotlight never finds you, is either a sign you're not doing anything consequential or not a sustainable model, especially if you do anything that touches the public's pockets in some way. I would much rather these organizations were more front-footed in building trust, building goodwill. Reckoning with this shifting reality means being less reactive and more deliberate in trying to shape your image. Now, some of this is about tone and humility, which we can all do with. Some of it is more substantive in terms of public accountability, almost a kind of organizational version of the contrition and of the check your privilege movement demanded of individuals. Some of it is about gently suggesting that there are other sides to the bigger coin. How many people, for example, recognize what Yayasan Hasanah does or even knows it exists? Or that Khazanah runs a not-for-profit Taman Tugu project preserving and conserving a 66-acre green lung in the heart of Kuala Lumpur? Or that every year Khazanah does not take from government but contributes dividends to its coffers? Or that how it invests has also evolved to learn from the mistakes of the past? I think organizations like Khazanah are fundamentally trying to do good things and have far more good and smart people than not. But in a sense, and in a very important sense, the opinion and knowledge of someone like me doesn't matter. That most other people out there are not aware of the good stuff that I just listed shouldn't be a point of self-satisfaction or worse, a reason to assign blame or ignorance on the part of the public. It should instead be an instigator of self-reflection, maybe even self-criticism, that despite all the previous and ongoing improvements that will doubtless continue to occur in the substance of our institutions, there still appears to be a little goodwill in the bank. Then there's the question of our political institutions. Are they up to the task of recognizing the moment and finding the right posture and language for it? I think the answer to the first part of the question is yes. Having been one, I feel politicians, as a collective, not always as individuals, are usually quite adept at sensing a mood change. But when it comes to reacting to it, will they seek to ride the wave of resentment because it helps the momentary political score? Or will they embark on the more difficult task of trying to build trust, to bridge, to unify, in terms of language, posture, and influencing outlook? Sitting here today, I don't yet see much signs of a desire to do the latter. Maybe it's the peculiarity of our politics today, how polarized it is. Maybe it's the key individuals in it, combative to the core, caught in their own resentments and hang-ups. Maybe there will come a time when their posture changes. Or, and we've said this for years only to be proven wrong, maybe a new generation of politicians can do things differently. I will probably on another episode, maybe on another series, talk about why I think our politics is broken. But that's not for today. The point today is I'm not holding out hope for the politicians to do these things out of their own volition. The non-politicians, like the ones I mentioned earlier, will probably have to do the heavy lifting here and have the politicians respond to that landscape instead. Even when the Fashion Valet controversy slips from the headlines, and it will, its echoes will linger, because it's exposed yet more fault lines in Malaysia's economic and social institutions that demand attention, not just from policymakers, but from all actors in it. Attention to the harder aspects of things like how we allocate resources more equitably, how we reform GLC functions, will be an arduous task for the policymakers and the actual establishment in authority. But for discerning individuals looking to build from this, our attention should be on how we answer the uncomfortable questions that this episode has brought up. Like, what are the values we prioritize? How do we apportion credit and debit for our own station in life? How do we carry ourselves publicly? How do we relate to the power and privilege that we happen to have or not have? At the same time, I can't help but feel a slight fatalism in my final assessment, in that whatever attention we give to this, things will get uncomfortable from time to time. Episodes like this will occur as social relations fray under the weight of their own contradictions. You see, a country where there is both loathing and intrigue of status, both mockery and deference of pseudo-feudal signifiers played out in 24/7 social media, is always going to be a country in some flux and some funk of some description. As a subject of inquiry, it is a fascinating moment of transition, which inspired this piece. But as a subject of nation building, until such foundational questions are resolved in some semi-permanent equilibrium, we remain a country of contradictions and of compromises, where it often feels the best we can do is to learn and respond in increments, as we should from this episode. Thank you for listening. You've just been listening to the pilot episode of Subtext with Sharil Hamdan. Please share with me your thoughts, your comments, your feedback. Do you like more of this? You want less of this? You don't want this at all? Just let me know, and happy to engage. Thank you.